Greetings, AP scholars, for our review for Unit 6 on causes of the Civil War. I'm looking at the review sheet from top to bottom here. John C. Calhoun on slavery. Remember, he's the author of Exposition and Protest, which says that a state can nullify a federal law within its borders. And remember the tariff crisis of 1832, which was in part reaction to the 1831 Nat Turner Slave Rebellion. And there's this idea in South Carolina and elsewhere in the South that if the North can interfere with things like a tariff against their will, that they could perhaps interfere with slavery as an institution. So John C. Calhoun is going to also take this argument that slavery is a necessary evil to a different position, that slavery is a positive good. That's actually a term termed by John C. Calhoun. Slave response to slavery, well, one thing that slaves did is they created a world of their own with meaning, with identity and family and marriage and friendship and music and folklore. And they refused to accept the definition that whites had that they weren't human. Beyond that, you had various levels of resistance, such as work slowdowns, sabotage, theft, destruction of equipment or crops, and then finally running away. Although that was not common, perhaps 1,000 slaves a year did make it to the North. 1844 election and James K. Polk. Remember, James K. Polk in 1844 is running on a manifest destiny ticket of expansionism, and he defeats the Whig candidate Henry Clay. And manifest destiny is this term which is coined by John O'Sullivan, who is a newspaper journalist, and it's this idea that the United States should stretch from coast to coast, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, an empire of liberty, as it were, spreading civilization and Christianity and democracy across the continent. The Oregon crisis of 1845 is where Polk is threatening England over the ownership of Oregon, which since 1818 had been shared and sort of postponed for resolution here. Oregon at this time, remember, is not the state of Oregon as we know it. It's the territory all the way from the Yukon down to what would be Oregon, including what would be Washington, British Columbia, Alberta, and parts of Idaho and Montana. And Polk says this whole thing belongs to us. And there's this slogan, 54-40 or fight. Remember, the 1845 Oregon Treaty will split Oregon in half at the 49th parallel, but before that we are saber-rattling to have all the way up to 54-40, which is basically the border of the Yukon, as the extent of American territory. And one reason why we back down over this is in 1846, war does break out between the United States and Mexico. But before we get to that war, let's look at Texas. Remember, there's really two wars between Americans and Mexico. One is between the Texans and Mexico in 1836. One is between the United States and Mexico in 1846. 1836, after a little over a decade of American settlement in the Mexican state of Texas, the Texans had been complaining about being forbidden slavery and being told that they have to be Catholic. And in 1828, Santa Anna overthrows the government of Mexico, and he takes over the state governments of Mexico as well. Just a piece of trivia here: the official name of Mexico is Los Estados Unidos de Mexico, the United States of Mexico, and Texas as a state. And the Texans had democratic government for a few years here until Santa Anna overthrew the government and made himself a dictator. So there's a whole series of complaints here, and the Texans are behaving very independently, defiantly. In fact, they're seizing supplies from Mexican forts, and Santa Anna will invade Texas in 1836, and you know about the slaughter at the Alamo and at the Goliad, and eventually Sam Houston and a Texan army will defeat Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto, and Santa Anna and the Mexican army will leave Texas. So for the next approximate decade, Texas is not brought into the Union because of the resistance of Northerners who do not want another slave state, and who certainly do not want a piece of territory that could conceivably split up into a number of slave states. But in 1845, Texas is annexed by departing President John Tyler, and in 1846, Polk is going to send troops into disputed territory between the Nueces River, which Mexico says is the border between Mexico and Texas. The Nueces River is north of the Rio Grande River, which or the Rio Grande River, which is where we say the border is, and some Americans patrolling are going to be killed by the Mexican army, and Polk is going to ask for a resolution or for declaration of war, in which he will get, but not before Lincoln challenges, and many Northerners challenge, where were these American soldiers? Prove that they were on American soil. And the spot resolution is Lincoln's challenge to Polk, saying that basically you provoked the war by putting soldiers on a spot which was not clearly American soil. Well, the war with Mexico is relatively brief, 1846 to 48. It ends in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where Mexico surrenders the Mexican cession for $15 million. And remember, this war goes way beyond the dispute of the southern border of Texas. When we get the Mexican cession, after we have militarily conquered it, we're getting California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, Nevada, and what would be really western Texas. So quite a bit of Mexico was peeled off here in this treaty. The Wilmot Proviso, early on in the war, there is a proposal which passes the House. David Wilmot of Pennsylvania is going to propose that there shall be no slavery in any lands that we acquire from Mexico. It does not pass the Senate, but it shows that there is an issue here that's around the corner. And that corner comes pretty quickly. The war ends between the United States and Mexico in 1848 with this Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In 48, within a year, gold is discovered in the 49ers, the people that show up. And within a year, you have enough people to make a state, and California petitions for statehood. And this brings about another issue of imbalance, only this time it would be on the north side. California wants to come in as a free state. Compromise of 1850, you should know the pieces of this compromise, which is one of the last hammered out by the great compromiser himself, Henry Clay, and that is, first, California comes in as a free state, and no slave trade will be in Washington, D.C. Those are two things the North gets. Two things the South gets: a very strict Fugitive Slave Act, which requires cooperation from northern law enforcement officials to capture, hold, and return runaway slaves. And the fourth thing is the popular sovereignty in the Southwest, which is the idea that the settlers will decide on slavery or not slavery, not distant politicians in Washington, D.C. There is a fifth part of this, which really isn't a north-south issue, but Texas surrenders its claim to New Mexico if the U.S. government will take over Texan public debt. Anthony Burns. Anthony Burns is sort of symbolic of the runaway slave issue and how that intersects with this new Fugitive Slave Act. He was a runaway slave who's doing abolition work in Boston, sort of the cockpit of abolitionism, and he is taken into custody under President Pierce's term in office. Pierce sends an army of about 1,000 soldiers to pull Burns out of Boston through an anti-slave crowd, and he's re-enslaved. He's put in chains on a boat, goes back to his master in Virginia. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. Let's fast forward a few years here. Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 is going to erase the 3630 line at the southern border of Missouri that goes across sort of approximately towards the Rocky Mountains here, dividing the South, which has allowed slavery, and the North, which has prohibited slavery. So this line, which had been in force for 34 years, is erased, and it does away with this compromise, and it angers the North. And the sponsor of the act is Stephen Douglas. He's finagling to build a railway he's from Illinois, and he's planning a railway, Transcontinental Railroad, which will have one of its terminuses in Chicago on its way out to California. So he's bought support from the South for this Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is going to allow slavery under the terms of popular sovereignty. That needs to be added here, that the settlers will decide. Well, Kansas is adjacent to a slave state, Missouri. You got these border ruffians go in, they vote illegitimately. The majority of the population of Kansas is free soilers. But what happens in this fraudulent election is you end up with a pro-slavery government at Lecompton and an anti-slavery government at Topeka, two constitutions, two sort of amateur military forces warring each other, and Kansas gets the nickname Bleeding Kansas in this time period. And you do have John Brown killing 5 settlers in 1856 at Pottawatomie Creek, the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, in retaliation for slavers burning and sacking and looting the town of Lawrence, the free soil town of Lawrence, Kansas. So Kansas is a pretty big mess. And in the Senate, there's a speech given called The Crime Against Kansas, given by Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, in which he just slanders the integrity and the honor of Southerners in this speech. And there's more details here, but the important point here is Preston Brooks, who's a South Carolinian, is going to sneak up behind Charles Sumner, and actually he doesn't really sneak up behind him, but he approaches this guy who's sitting down at a desk. It's good as a sneak attack, and he bashes Charles Sumner on the head multiple times with this cane with a metal tip, and Charles Sumner is got, he can't see, he's got blood going down his head, and the desk is sort of pulled out of the floor as the screws pull loose, and Preston Brooks has got a buddy with guns who's keeping people are trying to rescue Charles Sumner at bay, and I mean this is the violence of Kansas spilling over into the U.S. Senate. And Charles Sumner is going to come back to haunt the South. He's going to be one of the guys in charge of Reconstruction after the Civil War, so stay tuned. The Uncle Tom's Cabin and its significance. Harriet Beecher Stowe writes this book. It's about runaway slaves. It's about, at the very end, Uncle Tom, the protagonist, is murdered, is beaten to death by the evil overseer, Simon Legree. And it's really a Christian novel. You do have Uncle Tom pleading for the salvation of Simon Legree, which there's a lot of levels to this novel here. It's sort of implying that the South isn't very Christian, and it's definitely moving the argument of slavery away from an intellectual, ideological, political argument into something that's very, very, very heartfelt, very emotional. And this is staged. This is seen in theaters around the country and overseas. And Harriet Beecher Stowe later is nicknamed by President Lincoln as the little woman who started the war. The Dred Scott case, 1857. Remember, Dred Scott is a slave who for a while lived in Minnesota with a Southern military officer. And when Dred Scott returns to Missouri, he's going to sue for his freedom based upon his residency in a free state. And it goes to the Supreme Court, and Roger B. Taney, along with, it's a 7-2 ruling against Dred Scott, is going to rule. And there's no surprise here that Scott is he's chattel, he's animal property, kind of like a cow or a horse. He has no legal standing on the court. But Taney and the court throw in a freebie, and the intent here is to solve this argument about slavery moving into the territories, with the answer being that the federal government can't limit slavery anywhere based upon the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment says you can't take somebody's property without just compensation. And that's exactly what all of these restrictions in the Southwest and in the Missouri, what's left of the Missouri Compromise territory, which would be Kansas and Nebraska. So slavery doesn't end up going anywhere because the Civil War is very soon will break out here. But the South is the Supreme Court is throwing down the gauntlet here. Harper's Ferry. In 1859, John Brown appears again with 22 men, and they attack an armory at Harper's Ferry, which is part of Virginia. Now it's part of West Virginia. And the plan here is to arm the slaves for an uprising against their Southern masters. And he becomes symbolic of what many Southerners feel about the North: total lack of sympathy, total lack of concern about their lives and their property and their families, that basically the North wishes them all killed in their sleep. kind of like Nat Turner back in 1831 did. And for many Northerners, John Brown becomes a martyr because the state of Virginia will try him for treason and they will hang him. Free Soilers, the argument against slavery of most Free Soilers, the argument of the Free Soil Party and of the Free Soil movement in Kansas is not primarily moral. It's primarily that free labor can't compete against slaves. It's an economic argument. Similar arguments over Texas and Kansas to a dispute in 1820. Remember 1820, this dispute about Missouri. Should Missouri come in as a slave or free state? This is going to be what holds up Texas's admission for a decade. This is what the argument in Kansas is going to be over. The better argument for the purposes of the causes of the Civil War is not slavery as the cause, but the expansion of slavery into Western territory, which is claimed commonly by Southerners and Northerners alike. Why in 1860 did Southerners fear their rights were in jeopardy? Well, the North had a greater population, and the North could outvote the South, and there's this feeling that the South is insulted and resentful that slavery is being kept out of common territory that their soldiers too had fought to win during the Mexican-American War. And Southerners heard Northerners say that even though they weren't going to interfere with slavery in the South, that they believed that slavery should be bottled up, that it would eventually become extinct in the South. But yet the slave population is growing, and Southerners feared that without expansion into other territory, that they would be endangered by this increasing slave population. The election of 1860, well, you should know the four candidates who are running and the platforms that they had. Abraham Lincoln, who wins, is running on a platform of stopping the spread of slavery in the West. And this is important. He bends over backward to say that he will not touch Southern domestic institutions, meaning he won't touch slavery in the South, but he's against slavery spreading in the West. He's going to win because the Democratic Party splits. The Kentuckian John Breckinridge is going to be the Southern Democratic candidate who argues for absolutely the expansion of slavery everywhere, especially into the West. And Stephen Douglas, who is the Illinois candidate of the Northern Democrats, he's going to argue still for popular sovereignty, which is kind of a neat trick because popular sovereignty has just been ruled unconstitutional back in 1857, and he's got this whole Freeport doctrine that Northerners can't stop slavery, but they don't have to pass any laws to protect it in their midst. And then finally, you have John Bell, who's a constitutional union candidate. He's a Tennessean, and he's arguing basically for forbearance and continued discussion and just not to split apart or go to war. So Lincoln will win, even though he's not on the ballot in 10 of the 11 southern states. And he wins in almost no counties in Virginia, with the exception of what is West Virginia. So it's really an amazing thing here that Lincoln wins. But again, it proves that the South is being outvoted, that their population is being dwarfed by this growing northern population. Well, here we're at the brink of the Civil War itself. That's the end of the review. Study early, study well. Know the stuff. If it's on the review sheet, it's going to be on the test. Signing out.